I had never really been a puzzle person, but there it was, a beautiful, intricate 2,500-piece puzzle displayed on a shelf in a small, unassuming secondhand store I had wandered into. The box showed a captivating image of a serene lakeside at dusk, with trees casting rippling shadows over the water. The colors were rich, and there was something about it that seemed to call to me, almost like it wanted to be completed. It was an impulse buy, one I hardly thought twice about until I got home that evening and opened the box. The pieces were oddly shaped, some with jagged edges I'd never seen in a puzzle before. It seemed more complicated than the box made it look, but I shrugged off the oddness. After all, it was secondhand, and maybe that made it more interesting. I cleared the table in my small apartment, set up a lamp nearby, and began. For the next few hours, the world outside seemed to disappear. My phone buzzed several times, but I ignored it. Piece after piece began to fit, and yet the image didn't quite match what was on the box. Instead of a lake, it was more like a series of shapes, twisted and dark, as if the puzzle had somehow transformed into something else entirely. But I couldn't stop. Each piece felt like a key, and I had to find out where it led. By midnight, my eyes were aching, and I finally stepped back. It looked nothing like the cover, more like an abstract labyrinth, strange passages twisting around each other. I felt an unsettling tightness in my chest, like I'd lost time. I tried to shake it off and headed to bed, leaving the unfinished puzzle on the table. The next morning, I awoke groggy and unfocused. As I stumbled into the kitchen, I nearly dropped my coffee mug. The puzzle, it was different. Somehow more pieces had been added, and the image was evolving, now depicting what looked like a hallway, long and shadowy, disappearing into darkness. A cold chill settled in my stomach as I approached the table. Had I kept working in my sleep? I tried to dismiss it, but as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I called a friend, Mike. He was always the rational one. I needed someone to tell me I was being ridiculous. He came over, laughed when I explained, but agreed to help me finish it. We sat side by side, sifting through pieces, our conversation fading into silence as we worked. The hours blurred, the sun dipped, and eventually, Mike grew quiet, too quiet. I looked up to see him staring at a piece in his hand, eyes wide and vacant. "Mike?" I asked, but he didn't respond. He was transfixed, the piece slipping from his fingers. He slowly stood, his gaze unfocused, and walked straight out of my apartment without a word. I called after him, but it was like he couldn't hear me. I rushed to the window, watching him walk down the street, disappearing into the fog of the night. I tried calling his phone, but it just rang endlessly. That night, I didn't sleep. The puzzle remained on the table, and I sat watching it, heart pounding. I couldn't help myself. I reached for another piece, and it slid perfectly into place. The hallway depicted on the puzzle seemed to stretch further, deeper, almost like it was pulling me in. By the third night, I realized something was horribly wrong. I woke up to find myself sitting at the table, the puzzle nearly complete, though I had no memory of working on it. The hallway had turned into a door, slightly ajar, darkness spilling out from within. I shivered, fear gnawing at me. I tried to break it apart, to scatter the pieces, but my hands wouldn't move, like I was frozen in place. The compulsion to finish it was unbearable, desperate. I did some digging. I called the store, but they had no record of the puzzle. It was as if it had never existed. Then I found an online forum, people describing experiences eerily similar to mine. They spoke of a puzzle that seemed to shift each night, that changed them, that trapped them in its image. A user named Lost Soul 92 had written about a tech company, something about psychological experiments, cognitive manipulation. Their post ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if they'd vanished while typing. I tried to walk away from it. I left my apartment, stayed with my sister for a night, but when I returned, the puzzle was there, fully assembled. The door in the image was now wide open, and I could see, or maybe sense, something beyond it. It was like staring into a void, and yet I felt it staring back at me. A presence watching, waiting. The next day, Mike was found. He had wandered into a different town, disoriented, unable to remember his name. When I visited him in the hospital, he looked at me with eyes that seemed hollow, as if something inside him had been taken. He whispered one thing before turning away. "Don't finish it." That night, I knew I had to end this. I grabbed the puzzle, intending to burn it, destroy it. But as I touched the pieces, they seemed to latch onto my skin and my vision blurred. I was no longer in my apartment. I was in the hallway from the puzzle, the walls pressing in, the door ahead of me. I could hear whispers, fragmented voices urging me forward. My hands moved without my consent, fitting the final piece in place. Suddenly, I was back in my apartment, the puzzle complete before me. The door in the image was open, but now I could see a room beyond it, a room that looked exactly like mine. And standing in the doorway was a figure, featureless, yet somehow unmistakably me. It raised a hand, and I felt an icy grip on my shoulder. I don't know how much time has passed since then. Days, weeks. The puzzle remains on the table, but now it's no longer just an image. It's a mirror, a window, a doorway. And I fear that whatever lies beyond it is coming closer, piece by piece, night by night. I can hear it sometimes, shifting, rearranging, waiting for me to make the next move. Story 2. It started with a small impulse buy. I was walking through a crowded toy store, the kind that had every corner stuffed with shelves almost spilling with brightly colored action figures and collectibles. A set of action figures caught my eye, old-school wrestlers, the kind I used to collect as a kid. Nostalgia hit me like a freight train, and I grabbed them without much thought. The box was the last one on the shelf, and something about that made it feel special, like I'd found a rare treasure. When I got home, I unboxed the figures and set them up on my shelf. They fit right in with the old collection I still had in my basement. That should have been the end of it. Just another set of action figures, a little piece of my past brought back to life. But a few days later, when I came home from work, I noticed one of the figures wasn't where I left it. It was on the kitchen counter, its tiny plastic arm reaching out as if asking for help. I brushed it off at first. Maybe I had moved it absent-mindedly. Maybe my girlfriend had knocked it over and put it there. But the next morning, another one was out of place, now sitting on the bathroom sink, its face angled towards the mirror as if studying its reflection. A chill ran down my spine. I lived alone. My girlfriend had moved out months ago. Over the next few days, the figures kept moving. I'd leave the house with them lined up neatly on the shelf and come back to find them scattered in strange places. One on my bed, another near the front door, a third one with its plastic head poking out of the refrigerator. Each time they seemed to get closer to me, as if they were following me around the house. I decided to return them. Something about those action figures was wrong. I stuffed them back into a box and drove to the store. But when I arrived, the store looked different. The lights inside were dim, and the windows were covered in a layer of dust, as if it had been closed for years. The sign above the door was cracked and missing letters. I could have sworn it was bustling just a week ago. But now, it looked like no one had set foot inside for a long time. Determined to get rid of them, I tried to throw the box into the dumpster behind the store. But as I opened the lid, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around to see a man standing there staring at me. The store owner. His eyes were bloodshot, his clothes slightly disheveled like he'd been awake for days. He smiled, a crooked, unsettling grin, and said, "You can't throw them away. They belong to you now." That night, I began to notice more strange things. My phone battery drained inexplicably fast, even when I hadn't used it. Emails disappeared from my inbox, and my credit card was declined at a coffee shop. I decided to check the figures more closely, and that's when I found them. Tiny metallic chips embedded in their bases. They were tracking devices, meticulously hidden under layers of plastic. I ripped them out, feeling a strange mixture of fear and rage. Determined to understand what was happening, I spent hours online, digging through forums and obscure websites. Eventually, I found a thread from years ago. People were talking about action figures that showed up at their homes uninvited. figures that moved, that tracked them. The posts were old. Many of the users never replied again. They just vanished. One post stood out. A user claimed to have tracked down the maker. "He collects you," the post said, "not the figures." I realized then that the store owner wasn't just interested in selling toys. He was watching me, learning about me. I remembered his unsettling smile, the way he seemed to appear out of nowhere. I tried to call the police, but the call wouldn't go through. Static filled the line, then the faint sound of laughter echoed through the phone. Familiar laughter. It was the voice of the store owner. I knew I had to confront him. I went back to the store, but it was empty, abandoned, almost as if it had never existed. I walked around to the back, where I had seen him before. The door to the basement was slightly ajar. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air was damp and smelled of mildew. The walls were covered in shelves, each filled with action figures, hundreds of them. Each one different, each one staring blankly ahead. I moved closer, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. A figure that looked exactly like me, down to the clothes I was wearing. Panic set in, and I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. I heard footsteps echoing down the stairs, slow and deliberate. The store owner appeared, his smile wider than ever. "You shouldn't have come back," he whispered. He lifted his hand, revealing a small remote. He pressed a button, and the figures on the shelves began to move, their heads turning to follow me, their tiny limbs twitching as if waking from a deep sleep. I ran. I don't remember how I got out, but I found myself in the middle of the street, the cold night air filling my lungs. I looked back at the store, but it was gone. Just an empty lot where the building had stood. I still don't know if any of it was real, or if I was losing my mind, but when I got home, there they were. The action figures, lined up neatly on my shelf, their blank eyes staring right at me. Story 3. It started when Greg spotted the old wooden board game at a flea market, wedged between dusty boxes of vinyl records and mismatched china. It was an unassuming thing, carved with strange symbols and words in a language no one recognized. Greg was into weird collectibles, so he bought it on a whim and brought it to our weekly game night at his place. There was something about its lack of a name or instructions that intrigued us. It almost felt like an invitation daring us to play. The game had no dice, no cards, nothing but a board and small wooden pieces. Each piece was carved into something that looked like a cross between an animal and a weapon. A bird with a blade for a beak, a snake with scales made of gears. We laughed at how bizarre they looked as we placed them on the starting spots on the board. We shrugged and decided to make up our own rules to get things rolling. But as we moved our pieces along, we noticed something strange. The game seemed to react to what we were doing. It was almost like the board changed, shifting the pathways in response to our choices. None of us could quite put our finger on it, but as we played, it felt like an invisible force was guiding us. When Greg landed on a particular square, a thin compartment opened on the side of the board, revealing a small slip of paper. He read it aloud, his voice faltering halfway through. "Buy flowers for someone you love." Greg chuckled nervously and pocketed the paper, promising to do it the next day. We thought it was funny at first, a gimmick to make the game more interesting. But the next day, when Greg actually showed up at Emily's door with a bouquet of roses, we were stunned. He claimed he had no choice, he had to follow the note, and we all laughed it off as him being overly committed to the game. But things started getting weirder after that. The following week, we gathered again. Emily rolled her piece, a mechanical lizard, and moved it along the board until it landed on a square with another hidden compartment. This time, the slip of paper said, "Do not answer the next phone call you receive." Emily shrugged and put the note aside, but later that night, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen, her face going pale when she saw it was her boss calling. She hesitated, then remembered the game. Emily declined the call, and the next day, she learned her boss had been calling to inform her that layoffs were happening, and she was being spared for now. As the days passed, the game became an obsession. We kept playing, and it kept rewarding or punishing us. When it was my turn, I drew a slip that simply said, "Tell your friend the truth." I looked across the room at Greg, and I knew exactly what it meant. We had been hiding things from each other, small lies that grew into awkward silences. And as I spoke up, spilling everything I'd kept to myself, I could see Greg's eyes widen. He didn't say anything, just nodded, and there was this strange relief that settled over the room. It was like the game knew what was needed between us. We started to feel like the game was watching us, listening and adjusting itself. It was always a step ahead, predicting our fears, our desires, and our flaws. It began to create situations that forced us to face them. The next slip was for Mike. It said, "Go to the abandoned factory on 5th Street at midnight." The air in the room grew tense. No one wanted Mike to do it, but we also knew, deep down, that the game demanded it. That night, Mike went, with Greg and me in the car waiting just outside. The factory loomed in the dark, a skeletal structure, its windows shattered and its bricks crumbling. Mike entered, his phone streaming live to us. He walked through the dark corridors, the only sound being his footsteps echoing, until he found a room where a single chair sat under a flickering light. On the chair, another note lay waiting. "Take the chair!" As soon as Mike did, the factory doors slammed shut. Greg and I rushed to help, but no matter how hard we tried, the doors wouldn't budge. A click echoed over Mike's phone, and the live stream ended. We spent hours trying to get him out, but he was gone. By morning, when the police arrived, there was no sign of Mike, only that damn chair, now empty, and another slip of paper that read, "The game does not stop." After that, everything spiraled. We tried to quit. We really did. Greg burned the board, and Emily tried to smash her game piece, but nothing worked. A new board appeared on Greg's doorstep the next day, pristine, untouched, and with new pieces, all reflecting our fears now. Mine was a mask with tears carved into it. Emily's was a figure curled in a fetal position. Greg's piece had vanished, replaced by a cracked mirror. We realized the game was more than just a twisted pastime. It was a trap, a part of something larger, an experiment. We started noticing people in suits, standing just a little too close when we were out in public. Cars that followed us at night, but disappeared before we could get a clear look. It was Emily who discovered the truth first, or at least part of it. She hacked into a database following a trail of encrypted files and uncovered emails between a group of people called the Consortium. The game was theirs, a tool to manipulate players for data collection, to test how far we would go, what choices we would make, and what could be learned from our fear, our greed, our desperation. Greg, Emily, and I knew we couldn't keep playing. But every time we tried to ignore it, to leave it alone, something happened. Emily's car brakes failed one night on a familiar turn, and she barely made it out. A note was found in her car. "You do not ignore the game." Greg's house caught fire mysteriously, leaving him with nothing but the charred board game in the ashes. He moved in with me, and we tried to come up with a plan, a way to fight back. We were being cornered, bit by bit, but the worst was yet to come. My final slip came on a Tuesday night. "Choose someone to replace you." I couldn't breathe as I read it, the words twisting like knives. The board sat there waiting, an endless silent demand. Emily looked at me, her eyes wide, tears streaming down her face. Greg clenched his jaw, shaking his head, refusing to accept it. But we all knew, we all understood, that the game wouldn't let us go. Not until someone else took our place. And so we decided to end it. Not to pass it on, but to destroy it, no matter the cost. We knew it wouldn't be simple, that we were being watched, that whoever was running this twisted experiment wouldn't let us walk away easily. But we were done being players. As we drove out into the wilderness, the board in the trunk, we could feel the pressure closing in. Cars started following us, black, unmarked, headlights cutting through the night. We sped up, veering off the road and into the woods. We ran, carrying that cursed board, as the sound of footsteps and shouts grew closer. We reached a clearing, and with everything we had, we smashed the board to splinters, scattering the pieces into the wind. It didn't end there. Not really. We were arrested that night, questioned, released. We returned to lives that were empty, hollow. Mike was gone, our homes destroyed, our futures uncertain. But the game never returned. We had won somehow by refusing to play by their rules any longer. Still, sometimes I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shape, a figure, a shadow, and I wonder if the game ever really ended, or if it's just waiting, biding its time, for someone else to find it. And all I can do is pray that whoever finds it next doesn't make the same mistakes we did.